Hello, everybody. If you're here for the webinar on the issue of the Palestinian refugee issue, the Nakba, you're at the right spot. We're going to start in just a minute or two. We'll allow people to come in to join the webinar. So my name is Peter Larson. I'm the chair here in Ottawa, Canada, of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar today that we're doing in connection with Nakba Day, which is later on this week, on the ongoing Nakba, and in particular on the issue of the Palestinian refugees. I have a little background presentation. Perhaps the OFIP secretary can pull up the slide presentation just to set up the conversation today with our guest. So as they say, the conversation today is around the ongoing Nakba, the tragedy of the Palestinian refugees. And this is one chapter in a monthly series of OFIP educational webinars. Next slide. The agenda today, we're starting at 2. I'll spend 5 or 7 minutes going a little bit of background to the question so that we are all familiar with the basics. And then I'll conduct an interview with Lubna Shomali of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. I'll introduce her more properly in a second. Then we'll have a Q&A period. And for the question and answers, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And you can also raise your hand. We will be accepting a couple of live questions, as long as, and I urge anybody who does ask a question or make a comment, make a challenge, to do so briefly so that we can give the opportunity to several people to raise issues and to give opportunity to Lubna to respond. Then we will adjourn at 3:15. I remind people that this webinar is produced in Ottawa on traditional Anishinaabe territory. On the right-hand side, you see this is a week in which there is a lot of activity around the Nakba. In particular, on Thursday, there is some Palestinian Canadians that organized a Canada-wide Nakba commemoration event on the 12th of May. Next slide. So the background to this, which I think many people in the audience already know of, but in case some don't, or maybe a refresher is useful. You can go back as far in history as you want, but I'm going to take it back to 1947, when the UN decided to take part of historic Palestine and give it to European Jews in the wake of the terrible events of the Holocaust. And the idea was that the Jews would be able to create themselves a state. That was UN General Assembly Resolution 181 on November 29th, 47. Canada voted in favor of it. In fact, Canada was one of the subcommittee groups that recommended this be done. The idea was to mandate Palestine into 3, a Jewish state, which you see in blue or turquoise on your screen, an Arab state, which in beige, and then a neutral zone around Jerusalem under UN auspices. And that neutral zone would have included Bethlehem and Bethsahur, where our speaker is speaking to us from tonight. You'll see 33 countries voted in favor, 13 against, 10 abstained. You'll note from that how many, there are barely 55 members of the United Nations at that time. Now there are 200. And at that point, it was basically a European club. Most of the African and Asian countries were not yet members of the UN. Many of them were still colonies. The basic problem with this was that Palestine wasn't empty. There were already 1.5 million people living in Mandate Palestine. They were called Palestinians. And to create the country meant doing something to them. Next slide. After the UN vote, in order to have a Jewish state, the Jews had to be in a majority. But at the time, Jews were only 1/3 of the population. So that left 2 options. One was to expel the Palestinians, drive them out in some way. The other option was to encourage immigration of Jews. And in fact, Israel undertook to do both things. But starting the day after the UN vote, the Zionists started expelling the Palestinians. And in about a year and a half, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled, leaving all their possessions behind. Next slide. In the event, the Zionist militias went way beyond the UN provisions. You can see on the left map, the far left, That was the proposed UN partition. The middle map there shows that actually the green has become a lot smaller and the white has become a lot larger, and those became the armistice lines. And the Zionist militias took over more land than the UN had authorized. They took over a third of Jerusalem, which was not supposed to be the case. And of course, as I mentioned before, 750,000 of Palestinians were expelled, and the map on the right shows some of the major escape routes down into Egypt, into Gaza, into Jordan. Many escaped from the sea into the West Bank. So there are refugees in the West Bank as well. Next slide. So how did the UN react to the expulsions? Well, the UN was basically shocked at this. And in December 11th, 1948, it passed a resolution called the Right of Return, which proposed that refugees, those people who have been expelled, who wish to return and live at peace with their neighbors, should be permitted to do so at the earliest possible date. Next slide. So today we have an Israeli population of about 9.2 million, of whom about 1.7 million are Palestinians. But we have Palestinians circled all around Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Jordan. A total of about 11.5 million Palestinians, depending on how you count. Next slide. Now these numbers are a little bit old. Perhaps Lubna will be able to correct me if I'm wrong in any significant way, but the largest single chunk of Palestinian refugees are in Jordan, but there's also very large numbers in Gaza, of course, down in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. In the West Bank, about 750,000 refugees. The Syrian numbers I'm not sure of because of the terrible events that have happened in Syria in the last 2 years. And what people might not know is that there's actually 50,000 or so Palestinian refugees inside Israel. And then there's Palestinian refugees living outside, of course, in Canada, the United States, and in the Middle East, the Gulf countries. Next slide. So our guest speaker today, I'm thrilled to have Lubna Shomali. Lubna, you'll have to tell me afterwards whether I'm pronouncing your name properly. Lubna was born in Palestine, but raised in the USA. She has a BA or bachelor's degree in molecular biology and an MBA from the University of Michigan. But she moved back to Palestine, to West Bank with her family in 2008. She was an international relations officer for the Bet Sahur municipality, and she joined Badil in 2012. Thank you so much, and maybe we can end the slideshow. And here's Lubna. Lubna, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with us today. You're muted, Lubna.
I did that so you wouldn't have any background noise. But thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's terrific. Lubna, why don't I just start out? You and I have met a couple of times in Bethlehem at your offices in Bethlehem, but I don't know you very well. Remind us, why would somebody, you're born in Palestine, went to live in the States, then you decided to move back to Palestine, back to the West Bank, which most Canadians think is a kind of a hardship post. Like, why would you do that?
There's a number of different reasons, actually. One thing you'll find about Palestinians who are abroad or in exile, they are always homesick. They're always talking about Palestine. They're always remembering Palestine, their experiences in Palestine. And so there's always this urge or this want, I guess, a desire to go home, because it is home for many Palestinians, regardless of the fact if we're talking about people who left Palestine yesterday or today, or Palestinians who unfortunately have never set foot in Palestine. They're second and third and fourth generation Palestinian refugees. There's always this longing for being home. And I was no different in that regard. The second reason for us is because we wanted our children to be able to experience Palestine and understand the history, the culture, the people, the family that remained or was able to remain in Palestine, to learn the language, and that sort of thing. So it's an identity, I think, issue, because of the extremes that the Zionist movement and the Israeli regime went to try to erase Palestine and Palestinians and our history and our culture and even our language now. So I think that this for me, this is what brought me back.
Okay. Lubna, I explained you'd had a number of jobs before you ended up at Badil. Just tell us a bit more about what Badil is and does and what you do there.
Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights is a Palestinian human rights organization. Our specific area of expertise is in the historic and contemporary forcible transfer of the Palestinian people, or in other words, the creation, sustainment, and augmentation of the Palestinian refugee and internally displaced person population. So within multiple frameworks of international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, refugee law, and criminal law, we analyze the crisis of Palestine or the question of Palestine within these particular frameworks. And we provide analysis on the different things that we see happening here, the different human rights violations and international crimes that Israel is committing against Palestinians, as well as offer solutions or offering practical approaches to how to resolve the conflict.
Do you have, what is that? Does that mean that you're mainly a legal organization, or do you working with refugees? I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're doing.
Well, we basically have three main programs. One of the programs, of course, is so we produce this amount of legal evidence-based research in Palestine and Palestinians. So, for example, we produce every couple of years the survey of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, which in which we attempt to provide the most updated and current information on the situation of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, including the statistics, demographics, socioeconomic situation, distribution, any recent developments in their status, or any political developments occurring on the issue of Palestinian refugees. So we've also tackled issues like UNRWA and their chronic funding crisis, their temporary mandate, how they could make their services more effective and more appropriate for Palestinian refugees. We also do legal and international action. So we take the research that we have made and also use it in different legal advocacy tracks. We've submitted reports and statements and documentation to the United Nations Human Rights Council. We've sent reports to special rapporteurs, to different commissions of inquiry. We've sent reports to the ICC. We work with governments in terms of helping them to understand the situation of Palestinian refugees, particularly when they are facing secondary displacements, like the situation in Syria recently, where Palestinians were forced to flee yet again, right, and seek asylum elsewhere. So we use that research in the legal advocacy that we do. We also international advocacy, like, for example, that I'm doing. Prior to COVID, we were attending conferences and doing advocacy tours to different states with different different international civil societies, with our partner organizations abroad, and so on and so forth. We also have an international mobilization course that is actually you can register for now if you're interested. It's a 10-day course that is specifically for international activists.
We'll find the link to that and put it in the follow-up email.
Palestinian civil society, community-based organizations with a focus on youth and women, awareness raising, community mobilization, community resilience, and so on and so forth.
Just one thing, you've used several, this phrase, refugees and internally displaced people. I think that's unpack that for us a bit. What's the difference between, who are we talking about practically?
We're talking about the definition of what is a refugee or what is an internally displaced person, or IDP. Within international law, there is a category called forcibly displaced persons. And within this category, you have two different types, refugee and internally displaced person. A refugee is an individual that has been forcibly displaced or transferred and has been forced to cross an internationally recognized border. So in the case of Palestine, for example, Palestinians who were displaced during the mandate and left mandatory Palestine, those individuals would be considered refugees. What happened during the Nakba from that period, 1947 to about 1949, and Palestinians who were forced out of what came to be called Israel, or crossed the Green Line and entered into what came to be called the West Bank Strip or the surrounding countries, those individuals are referred to as refugees by international law. If a person is displaced but remains within the entity and does not cross an internationally recognized border, that individual is referred to as an IDP, or an internally displaced person. Currently, the number of Palestinian refugees numbers 9.1 million worldwide. The number of IDPs, internally displaced, on both sides of the Green Line, meaning inside what is now called Israel and also inside the territory occupied in 1967, those individuals roughly number about 817,000. So we're talking about almost 10 million people.
Okay, so I used a number, 50,000 that I picked up somewhere for Palestinian refugees inside Israel. Is that more or less right, or is in the order of magnitude? Is that right?
I mean, and where you got that number from, but there is, for example, a refugee camp inside Jerusalem, and depending on whether or not you consider Jerusalem in the West Bank or in Israel, then you would consider those individuals refugees.
Okay.
What's more likely is that that number came from those that were originally internally displaced persons inside the area that came to be called Israel. So during that, not only were 750,000 Palestinians displaced outside that area, but another 50 to 60,000 Palestinians were displaced internally.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So let me just come to what I think is the heart of the issue. I think that my experience is that most of the people on this call will be, they certainly will not be, not very many will be as aware of the law as you are, but they will be in general comfortable with the proposition that what was done to the refugees was totally unfair, that they should have the right to return, that the UN has voted for it, and that would be the fair and proper thing to do. But, and here's the but, I think that I know from discussing with a lot of sympathetic people, they don't think it's possible. And so they argue to me that you're just wasting your time. If it's not a real possibility, then why waste your energy trying to do that? Instead, why not focus on some other compensation or some two-state solution or whatever? So I'd like to go at these things fairly one by one. I'll give you the first argument that I often get is that, well, just plain and simple, Israel won't allow it. Israel's too strong. It has the third largest military in the Middle East. It doesn't want the refugees back, won't even accept any responsibility for it. So what makes you think that it could happen, and what would be the conditions do you think that could make that possible?
Well, of course, Israel won't allow it, because in order to maintain its colonial apartheid regime in Palestine, and in order to be able to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians, in order to maintain that fabricated demographic majority, which they don't have anymore, by the way, because if you look at the number of Palestinians and the number of Israelis that are living in mandatory Palestine, the number is actually quite even at 6.1 million apiece. So the return of refugees outside of mandatory Palestine would definitely tip the scales in favor of Palestinians. So of course, Israel doesn't want to let go of the privilege, and Israeli civil society doesn't want to let go of the privilege that the Israeli colonial apartheid regime offers them. I mean, and the only way that would happen is if the international community, and by international community here, I mean third-party states, the UN, the EU, et cetera, imposes this responsibility on Israel. So when within international law, when a state perpetuates severe human rights violations and international crimes, the international community is obligated to hold it accountable. Not only that, but the state committing the crime or the entity committing those crimes needs to offer reparations to the victims of those crimes. In terms of forcibly displaced persons, the reparations that are supposed to be offered have four components: the right to return, voluntary physical repatriation to the place of origin or habitual residence, and this is loosely called the right of return in general. Compensation for any damages that incurred, and this would also include psychological damage. Compensation, property restitution, the return of the original properties lost, and guarantees of non-repetition. The reparations package for forcibly displaced persons is not one or the other, but is a combination of all four. And because Israel and the Zionist movement and the Zionist militias were the entities that not only created the Palestinian refugee and IDP population, but also maintained it, then they are the ones that are legally obligated to provide reparations. And the only way that can come about, as I said, is if the international community forces Israel to fulfill its obligations and responsibilities.
All right, got you. But so far, the international community doesn't show any inclination to do so. Israel is opposed to it. America supports Israel, and Canada supports Israel. The Europeans kind of waffle. Like, my question is, what combination of forces would be required? What would have to change so that the international community would try to enforce this? They show no inclination to doing so far, and repeating over again that they should do it doesn't do it. So what would have to change so that this is no longer the case?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge gap between what should happen within international law and what is actually happening within international law. And the bottom line is where there's a will, there's a way. And so we, as Palestinian civil society, and of course the international solidarity, have an obligation to pressure our governments into bringing Israel into compliance with international law. So there's definitely a role for civil society to play, much in the same way as they did for former apartheid South Africa, with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which Palestinians also have a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. There is also the legal advocacy that we do. This is another path or another way to create pressure on states to fulfill their obligations under international law. So submitting reports to the UN, like what Badil is doing, and other human rights organizations. The recent reports on Israel being an apartheid states by Human Rights and Amnesty International. The report by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, also on apartheid. We need acknowledgement from the international community that there is a situation and that other crimes are being committed by Israel. Once that acknowledgement comes, much in the same way as it did for South Africa, then we will have a situation in which the UN and other member states urge for practical measures to bring Israel into compliance with international law.
You know, in our situation in Canada is even our most progressive churches, for example, the United Church of Canada, which has been quite strong in its defense of Palestinian rights, still has a limited support for the right of return. The latest document that I'm aware of said that well, the right of return is okay as long as it doesn't upset the demographic balance, which of course is the whole point of the Israel's objection to it in the first place, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also the point of how can we actually have closure or rid ourselves of the apartheid and colonial nature of the Israeli regime in you to deny Palestinians their right of return. There is no way to find a solution that a true, lasting, sustainable, peaceful solution, a true peaceful solution, not the so-called peace process with Oslo, because that's not giving us any type of peace. But how can we resolve the issue without having the return of Palestinian refugees? The conflict would continue to be ongoing without Palestinian return.
Let me change gears a little bit here, Lubna. When Palestinians do get the right to return, and they return in significant numbers, how do you imagine, and then by virtue of what you said earlier, Israel will no longer have a Jewish majority, and rapidly would assume it would no longer be legally a Jewish country because the number of those discriminated laws would fail. What would you see the role of Jews in Israel after the 2 million or 3 million or 4 million or however million decide to return? How do you see that?
I'm not sure what you're asking, but I think that when we take on a process of decolonization, and Palestine isn't the first situation in which we have to decolonize. And it also isn't the first situation in which we have repatriation or return of refugees and internally displaced persons. Mm-hmm. There are a number of cases within history in which we have cases of return and repatriation packages and peace true negotiations happening in order to resolve situations of international crimes and human rights violations. So there is a wealth of experience and a wealth of also practical measures or best practices used by states within international law that dictate how return is supposed to occur and what is supposed to be offered. I mean, the right to reparations exists because international legal frameworks created the right to reparations as a resolution to international crimes and human rights violations. So it's not something new that was created just for us, or that we have to consider as a novelty or something that is strange or unique. It's actually one of the things that has been going on within international law and within our history as human beings. And wars and so on and so forth. So we just have to follow the guidelines as put forth by international law. And those guidelines are actually quite practical and quite...
Missed the last part of it. You cut out there. You said quite practical and quite...
feasible.
Feasible. Okay. We actually have a similar process that has just barely been engaged in Canada. It's called the Truth and Reconciliation Process. It has to do with our relations to our Indigenous people who we colonized. And there are a number of movements associated with that in parallel. One is called Land Back, which has a program of trying to restore land to Indigenous people. So I understand what you're saying, that there are similar kinds of decolonization movements that have taken place in different countries around the world. On a practical level, Lubna, there are, as you say, well, there's some discussion. I think you gave the number of 9 million refugees. Let's just take that. Some of them include refugees who live in Canada or Michigan who might never want to actually return to live there, but some would, and so on. Certainly, we're talking about potentially 5, 6, 7 millions of people. That can't happen. Let us imagine a world in which the UN says tomorrow, okay, Israel, the jig is up, you got to do it. And if you don't do it, we'll apply sanctions on you or whatever. And so Israel says, okay, we'll let the refugees come back. Then that can't happen overnight. I mean, it will be a huge movement of population. People can't return to be sheep farmers like they were 40 years. How do you envisage, how might that unfold?
Absolutely. What you're saying is absolutely true. And never in a situation of return has everyone swarmed home and come back. So we don't have this idea of millions of Palestinians all of a sudden popping up inside mandatory Palestine or coming to mandatory Palestine. Reparations packages or reparations procedures are actually very controlled, and it occurs in stages. Additionally, alongside the reparations and the actual return, there also has to be projects or investments or things being done, reconstruction, building up the economy.
Well, you need schools and houses and so on, right?
Exactly. So if we take, for example, the situation in former Yugoslavia and the damage that was done during the war there, and complete cities and completely wiped out. There were huge reconstruction projects that occurred before the repatriation of all the refugees, or practically all of the refugees that fled from that conflict. So that's nothing new either, because one of the things, of course, that Israel claims is that their homes are gone, because we know that during the Nakba, almost 500 Palestinian cities, towns, and villages were depopulated and destroyed. But nobody said for Palestinians, oh, okay, let's rebuild, which is exactly what is that there should have been a rebuild, just like what happened in Libya. So is not a procedure that's left, to happen all by itself. There have to be international agencies involved. There have to be countries involved. There have to be INGOs, international non-government organizations involved. There has to be a situation created that can absorb the returnees and create a situation that is better than the situation that was prior.
Okay, I'm going to now turn to some questions from the audience and build some in. Actually, I saw one that maybe we should have addressed earlier. Someone asked for a definition of the Nakba. Maybe you could just help us with understanding what the parameters of that is.
Well, the historic definition of the Nakba is the period that occurred between 1947 and 1949. And Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. And it's used to designate that particular period in Palestinian history in which the largest number of Palestinians either became refugees or internally displaced persons. Now, there were periods, for example, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, and that's the rest of Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza Strip, where we had another huge wave of displacement, or another creation of a huge number of Palestinian refugees in this. But the Nakba is used traditionally to that period. About the Nakba, ongoing Nakba, and by we talk about the ongoing Nakba because we talk about a process that never ended, that the displacement and transfer of Palestinian people is an ongoing thing. It may have started with the Zionist militias, as you said, in 1947, but it actually has continued all the way up until today. So we still see this very day the displacement of Palestine, the creation of refugees and internally displaced persons.
I just remind everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. I'll be picking them up, or raise your hand. We'll be able to accept a certain number of live questions. But one question that was in the Q&A is maybe a simple one, but why is it that Israel gets to determine all this? And that's a basic question, but why is it that Israel gets to decide who gets to come back and not? I mean, you said it yourself earlier that Israel is a superpower.
among the nations of the world. And it has a lot of influence. It has a lot of backing. And when I say backing, I mean they have political backing, they have financial backing. There's a lot of interests to be taken into consideration when we talk about Israel and its domination, or its the role, the authority that it's been playing, not only in the Arab region but with other states. Another question would be to ask is why there's being so much done against Russia and not Israel, because the same crimes that Israel committed, Russia is committing today, and yet we see a response from the international community, as we should. Sanctions and aid and cutting of diplomatic ties. So the international community is fulfilling its responsibilities vis-a-vis the Ukrainian people, but never has, and in 74 years has never fulfilled its responsibilities vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. So it shows not only the double standard of powerful Western states, but it also shows the biased application of international law. And it's based on who holds the power and who holds the finances, I guess, or the fund, the money. We have to follow the money, I guess.
But isn't it? I mean, isn't it that the West and the U.S. in particular actually believes and supports the notion of a Jewish state? It's not just that they don't enforce the law; they actually have an agenda. It seems to me that the United States wants Israel to exist, has spent huge amount of money protecting it. And while it may say that feels sorry for the Palestinians, in fact, it's one of its key objectives in the Middle East is to support Israel, because Israel is key to controlling the Middle East. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. Israel is a strategic ally in the Arab region. And it was things that makes it active or keeping it in power is that it does provide that geographic, strategic, financial, diplomatic ally that the West wants. So of course they would want to keep them in power.
I mean, I think we can look elsewhere. The American government seems to be willing to support dictatorships and injustice where it serves Saudi Arabia as a case in point, or Pinochet's Chile as a case in point, where it serves their interest, but they will make a lot of stink about it if the opposite serves their interest, right? That's pretty basic, I think. Peter M. has asked a question, Lubna, about how about how Palestinian refugees are, some people say that the Palestinian demand for their refugees is different from the rights of other refugees. For example, sorry, I'm losing my voice here. For example, the notion that refugee status is inherited. So these people, they argue that it's unfair that 750,000 people has now grown to 7 or 8 or 10 million, however number you calculate. How do you respond to that issue of the right of your children, for example, to be refugees, if that's the case?
Well, within international law, the only way your refugee status or IDP status can be resolved is when you are allowed to exercise your right of return. So the inheritedness of refugee status is not particular or unique to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. It's just because Israel continues to deny Palestinian refugees their right of return that the subsequent generations of the subsequent descendants of refugees continue to be refugees. It's the same is true for, I mean, we are the most protracted case of displacement in the world, but there are other protracted case displacement, for example, Afghanistan or Tibet. There are other cases in which, okay, not 74 years, but there are cases, for example, 25 years. We have Syrian refugees today who are the descendants of the refugees that fled during that most recent conflict, and their descendants will be refugees. The same for the Ukrainians. If there is a situation of denial of return or inability to return because the situation is not safe, then have a situation of protracted displacement, and their descendants will also be considered refugees. So it's not particular to us. What's unique about our situation is that Israel has been able to get away with denying Palestinian return for 74 years. That's what's unique about our situation. Not the declarations of refugees or refugees. It's a standard within international law.
So there are a number of refugees who can't return to, for example, Syria, or can't return to some places because there's an ongoing war. Are there any other refugee groups in the world who cannot return by where it's safe, but only because the country that expelled them won't let them back, or is that unique?
I mean, I think not that I can think of off the top of my head, but the process of reparations, for example, is still going on in former apartheid South Africa. So whereas in that case, they have a situation of internal displacement than refugees, where people were shifted within the state itself and not necessarily out of the state. There's still a situation there in which they are creating a feasibility for those internally displaced South Africans to return. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because what's also unique about the Palestinian situation is that Israel was never a pre-existing state. It was actually a movement. It was a Zionist movement. There was never an actual state from which there was movement from, like, for example, when the British colonized India, we had a very defined state in the Great Britain, and we also had a very defined state in the case of India. So there's a lot of differences, or there's a little bit of uniqueness, let's say, to our situation that doesn't exist for other refugee situations.
Okay. Question from Steve Chappell. He notes, in the context of Israel is now has declared these 5 or 6 other civil society organizations terrorist organizations. Israel applies that terrorist label pretty broadly. What kind of pressure is Badil under?
I mean, we have to take that designation within the context of the EU sanctions list, the sanctions list, which declared 6 or 7 Palestinian political parties as terrorist organizations or terrorist entities. From that, we had conditional funding, where the EU put in clauses within their funding contracts. The EU and its individual member states put in clauses within their granting contracts in which we as Palestinians had to recognize the criminality of our resistance movements and political parties. And from that, Israel was able to make, let's say, or progress to this designation of these 6 organizations as terrorist organizations. So the weaponization of terrorism is being used by Israel to basically annihilate Palestinian civil society. And that's what's happening. And so the designation of those first 6 organizations is just the tip of the iceberg. Without a response, or without a practical response from the international community, more organizations will be designated as terrorist organizations, and then individuals will be designated as terrorist individuals. And so we keep seeing progression and continued aggression by Israel against Palestinians. And of course, it's been a part and parcel of dehumanizing and delegitimizing the Palestinian civil society and the Palestinian resistance movement, so that they can have full nation over Palestine and the Palestinian people.
There is a big campaign in Canada now against Sami Doon, and attempt to link it to terrorism as well. It's been several media articles around that here in Canada just this last week. I have another question about the right of return. Jim Guild asked whether the right of return is basically owned by individual refugees, or whether it's internally displaced people, or is a collective right that someone can bargain for. Like Abu Mazen said 15,000 refugees could return, and that would be enough. Is it bargainable? And who gets to do the bargaining if it is bargainable?
The right of return is what is called an inalienable right. Self-determination also, for example, is also an inalienable right. For the Palestinian people, and this also depends on which means that it cannot be, okay. So the right of return is what is called an inalienable right. So is the right of self-determination. And what that means, inalien, is that it means that that right cannot be derogated from, meaning it cannot be changed or altered. It doesn't expire. So it is a basic right, an inalienable right. And there's a difference between the two under international law. And so for us, the Palestinian case, we are also unique, well, not necessarily situation in the way in which we were displaced, and the historic, our history. Our right of return is both individual and collective. It means that no one can decide for us, no matter who it is, Israel, the United States, our own leadership, the Palestinian Authority, cannot decide for us if we choose to return. It has to be our own choice. Our people, as in the Palestinian people, because we are recognized as a people, also have the collective right of return. So for us, it's a situation in which there is no one or no thing or no power or no entity, which means that any that can make this decision for us to return or not to return. And also, it means that any kind of peace agreement that doesn't include the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs is null and void. So why do I bring this up? Oslo. Oslo is one peace agreement, and I use that wording very, very loosely, that doesn't include anything about the right of return and the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people.
If it's an individual, help me sort out this. It's a collective right, and it's an individual right as well. But we've agreed, at least I think what you're saying is that it won't be overnight for let's say 5 million as a good number, 5 million refugees to return to Israel. There's going to have to be some prioritization, which means that some person who has their right is going to say, well, I'll go in 6 months from now, not now, because someone else is, for whatever reason, whatever criteria, are more urgent. Let's imagine that refugees in Syria are in the worst shit. There's going to have to be some collective process for working out priorities as this unfolds, correct?
In the same way that the UN created UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, to humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinian refugees,
right.
There needs to be an international agency created to facilitate, coordinate, and implement the Palestinian repatriation. So we do actually have an organization that was created by the UN, and that's the UNCCP, but it's a defunct organization. It's not active, it's not doing any work. But like you said, the repatriation process is a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. And there has to be prioritization of who is going to return first. It's going to happen in stages. We have to also make considerations for what's going to happen on the ground. We have to have housing, we have to have schools, we have to have health centers, we have to maybe create roads, and so on and so forth. So it's not something that, you know, it might actually take longer than the Nakba itself, or the ongoing Nakba, let's say.
Okay. All right. Changing gears again, somebody asked a question that came up recently. Why is it that the surrounding Arab countries have not been more supportive of the Palestinians generally and of the Palestinian right to return specifically?
I don't know what you mean by more supportive.
Well, supportive, let's say supportive.
I still don't know. I mean, what is expected?
Well, I mean, just take the obvious countries, example that sorry.
In terms of
what jumps out at most people right now is a number of these countries signed these Abraham Accords, where they basically are normalizing with Israel and not making return of refugees an issue. For example, we could go through a whole list of.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and Israel's very strategic, knocked the Arab countries one at a time. Formed Jordan, it formed a peace agreement with Egypt, it formed it with the countries in the Gulf, and so on and so forth. And the countries that it didn't form agreements with, it had a hand in creating internal upheaval. So, for example, what happened in Syria, what happened in Lebanon, what happened in Iraq, Iran, and so on and so forth. So the Arab states have not been able, or maybe I would also say are unwilling, because their interests don't necessarily lie with supporting the Palestinian refugee right of return.
Okay. Someone just asked us the question here: how did you get the right to return? So you were living in the States. You returned. The person asked, "Are you a citizen of Israel? What's your status? How did you get the right to return?"
Okay. I have a West ID. So in addition to my American citizenship, I also have a West Bank ID. Israel has not taken it from me yet. They have not denied me entry when I've come home. And prior to actually moving here in 2008, I would come back every 3 or 4 years to renew that ID. And so it gives me the ability to be able to reside here continuously. Not everyone was able to do that, and not everyone was able to return to maintain that ID or not have it withdrawn by Israel. So with that ID, I am able to come back and not necessarily travel freely, but have a little bit more mobility than, let's say, a Palestinian with a Gaza ID.
Okay. Another practical question. Actually, 2 related questions. What's life like for Palestinians in refugee camps? I know that that's complicated because it depends a lot which refugee camp and which country you're in and so on. But since you're in Bethlehem, there are refugee camps right around you there. Can you give us kind of a thumbnail of what it's like to live in, I think it's the Aisha camp in Bethlehem? Just give us a bit of a thumbnail.
Absolutely. Aisha camp has almost daily incursions from the Israeli military. They come in to harass almost every night. There's usually shooting and tear gas being utilized. Sometimes they'll come in for military exercises. Sometimes they'll come in to detain or arrest Palestinian youth. And sometimes I think they just come in for fun. There is a lack of water, there is a lack of space, there is a lack of privacy, there is a lack of infrastructure. Recently, the Israelis have been using the electricity to try to create a situation that is unbearable living conditions. So they've been cutting off the electricity, much the same way that is the standard now in the Gaza Strip. They're starting to implement that same kind of practice here in the West Bank. So there's a lack of also health facilities and services being provided, despite the fact that UNRWA is still operating in the refugee camps. The quality and quantity of services has gone down significantly, particularly with the decreasing of funds, the cutting off of funds, and the conditioning of funds to UNRWA. So the situation is not fantastic.
What you say there to a Canadian living in Ottawa sounds hard to believe. Hard to believe that the Israelis are unprovokedly sort of attacking refugee camps, cutting off electricity, making life miserable for the Palestinians. Why in the world would they do that? What's their objective?
Their objective, of course, is to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. Remember that the Nakba is ongoing, and so the goal, of course, to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible, and not do it perhaps in the same way as they did in the Nakba, where they actually physically moved with physical force Palestinians from their places of origin and habitual residence, but to create a coercive environment in which they really have no choice but to leave. Because if you can't get health care and you can't find a job and you can't support your family and you don't have anywhere to live and you don't have water and you don't have electricity, why would you stick around? You would try to find another place to go where you could get those basic needs met. And so, of course, the whole thing is, the whole regime all about this ongoing displacement and transfer of Palestinians.
But, and correct me if I'm wrong here, my understanding is that while it's creating misery for the Palestinians, if their objective is to get them to leave, it's not working very well. There are now more Palestinians living in historic Palestine than any time in history. Right? I don't think there's a huge exodus of Palestinians now. Am I wrong on that?
No, yeah, you are wrong, because every young Palestinian I talk to particularly those in the refugee camps, are a way out. They are seeking, for example, student visas. They are seeking work visas for other areas. They are ways in which they can get citizenship or get some kind of resident alien type status in another country. So there's definitely Palestinian youth are definitely seeking ways to leave Palestine. I mean, you're not seeing it happen in the way we saw it happen in 1948, but they are and trying to find ways to leave. So that is happening. The fact that there is an even number of Palestinians and Israelis also is contributed to the fact that Israel is having a really hard time convincing people to come to Israel, because people are starting to see that the only democracy in the Middle East is not necessarily a democracy. So they are seeing the actions of Israel, and they are seeing what the Israeli regime is doing to Palestinians, and how the wars on Gaza, and how the extrajudicial killings and so on, and the human rights violations and the ongoing international crimes. And they don't want to have any part of that. So it's not only the Palestinians seeking to leave, but it's also those who are who immigration or colonization of Israel is also not going in the direction that they want it to go.
Okay. I think I'm right about the overall numbers. I believe that total number of Palestinians living in historic Palestine is greater than any time in history, notwithstanding the fact that a number are trying to leave. But that's interesting what you raised there.
I mean, it's difficult to leave. I'm not saying that it isn't.
Yeah.
Finding ways to get visas to other countries, particularly work visas or visas that would allow you long-term residency. That's not easy. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that Palestinians aren't seeking them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course, I understand. A different question here from Carly Hunt. What does it mean in practical terms to be an internally displaced person within Israel? Let's leave aside the camp there you were talking about that was sort of a peculiar step. But there, I'm sure you know much better than I. There are thousands of internally displaced persons all over Israel. What does it mean practically?
Well, Palestinians inside Israel have Israeli citizenship, which makes them not necessarily a second-class citizen, but more like third or fourth-class citizen. So whether you are an internally displaced person inside Israel or someone who hasn't been displaced yet, you still have that Israeli citizenship. So whatever rights or freedoms that Israeli citizenship gives you as a Palestinian residing inside what is now Israel, that's what you would have. And in terms of their counterparts, which would be Jewish Israelis who have both citizenship and nationality, they are definitely, like I said, third and fourth classes within Israel.
So maybe you can help me understand the law around a practical situation that I've run across. I met a man whose family was from Safuria, north of Nazareth. They were expelled from Safuria. They went to Lebanon. They eventually came back to Israel. He became an Israeli citizen, but he lost his family house, and in fact, he's no longer able to return to Safuria. So he is he is an internally displaced person. Is that he fall into that category? Is that what we're talking about?
He's still residing inside what is now Israel?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes, he's now a citizen of Israel,
yes,
but not allowed to go to his city.
Whereas, absolutely, he can't go. I mean, yeah, the denial of return is not just for the refugees, but also those who are internally displaced. So imagine that you can see your home, or you can see where your parents lived and your grandparents lived, but you can't go there. You can't live there. You can't reclaim that land or that home or that property. So yes, he would be an internally displaced person with an Israeli citizenship.
Okay. I'm looking for which countries do grant Palestinian refugees citizenship. Do you have a list of that? Is it a...
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What countries do grant Palestinian refugees citizenship?
Good one. None that I know of. None that I know of. I mean, for example, I mean, I can give it like in practical ways. There are ways to transfer your nationality to your spouse, for example. So for me, because I'm in citizenship, when I married my husband, I transferred my citizenship to him. And there are ways that you can apply for a second citizenship, where you would go through those procedures and apply for it. But in general, there isn't an overwhelming desire among states to provide Palestinians with an alternative citizenship.
There are, I happen to know from here in Canada, I know a number of Palestinian refugees who have Canadian citizenship. For example, you could be born in Lebanon as a refugee and eventually apply for immigration status to Canada. So you come to Canada as an immigrant. So you do have Palestinian refugees who are also Canadian citizens. They haven't lost their legal rights as refugees by virtue of becoming Canadian citizens, if I understand that correctly.
Yes, that's correct. I didn't say become an another country, because I also have American, and it doesn't negate my status. So
Right.
secondary doesn't negate refugee status. It only provides a secondary citizenship.
Right.
So I didn't mean it to say that there are no Palestinians with secondary
Right.
citizenship, but what you asked me which countries are willing or are favorable to, that's at least the way I understood it, to providing citizenship to Palestinians, which if they go through the process and the country approves, then, but I mean, is there anyone out there, for example, offering Palestinians alternative citizenship? There's nobody out there doing that.
Right. I think because we have lots of refugees in Canada, many from the Eastern Europe, I sometimes get questions in my class about why should I not have the right to return to Poland or the right to return to wherever. And I say, well, you do. All you got to do is get a visa and you go. If the Palestinians don't have the right, that's the major difference, right? For most people have now whether or not.
Yeah, I mean.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead and finish your thought. I'm sorry.
If they have property that was confiscated and if they have legal documents to show it, they could take it to a court. They may or may not win. We can't, right? But in this situation, the Palestinians are not given, uniquely not given the right to even do that.
They're not even given the option.
Right.
I mean, they have the right. The right is there and it exists, but the option to do that, there is a denial of a return. So there are actual obstacles in place that prevent that from happening.
You mentioned at the beginning, we're getting close to the end here, Lubna, you mentioned that you have done some speaking in Europe and in North America. Does Badil ever send people, before COVID, for example, does Badil send people to Canada? And if so, who do you talk to here? Do you talk to churches or unions or legislators? Who do you see and what kind of reaction do you get?
Well, usually these visits are organized by our partner organizations. So, for example, I've been on tours to different parts of the United States with JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, where they would go ahead and arrange the different locations that we would be expected to speak at, and they would do the invitations and arrange that whole thing. And we don't have a partner in yet, so throwing that out there, in Canada, who has hosted Badil for either a conference or a speaking tour or what have you. That was something that we would definitely be open to. We have spoken at different locations, different institutions, spoken to different people. We've spoken, for example, with trade unions in Spain. We've spoken to political parties in Italy. We've spoken to the Jewish community in the United States. We've spoken to other activists, other Palestinians in exile. So we are open to speaking to whoever would like to know or to whoever would like to listen about the situation in Palestine. Well, and we've talked about all sorts of things like practicalities of return, the ongoing displacement and transfer, reparations is supposed to look like, what the international community is supposed to do, and so on and so forth. So we're kind of flexible.
Well, I hope OFIP Secretary has noted your eventual availability, and I hope that other people on the call have also noted that as well. Maybe at some point we'll be lucky enough to get you or someone else from Badil to come and help us push this forward. I'm going to ask you just to hold there for a second, Lubna. I'm going to say goodbye and thank you in a second, but I want to just put up two slides on the screen before I do that, if I can. Yeah, so I just remind people that this is one of a series of monthly educational webinars we've organized since COVID, basically. We used to do 2 public meetings a year, and now we do monthly meetings. Our objective is to try to educate people, address the real questions that bother people about the Israel-Palestine issue by bringing in very knowledgeable experts, including Lubna. We do this, we are a voluntary and self-financed organization. We don't get any government funding. We basically live off the work of our volunteers and by the occasional e-transfers, donations that we get. And I will, in a follow-up email, I'll be inviting you to make a small contribution. And by the way, we will be making a contribution to Lubna's organization. I know they also struggle to make ends meet there. Next slide. And if you want to find more about our organization is called the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. There's its web address, and you can find our mission, our objectives, our board of directors, our board of counselors. And also, we publish a blog every week at Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. I will be sending the links to both of those things to you in a follow-up email. This conversation today has been recorded, and it will be sent to all of you as well as to those people who registered but weren't able to join us today. That's the end of the slide. I'll go back to putting Lubna on. Lubna, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your enthusiasm, your insights with us. We hope to see you in Canada, or you or one of your colleagues in Canada. We think that the refugee issue, in my view, is probably the most difficult. I think it's under talked about because it's somehow easier to talk about the settlements or about the wall or about Jewish only roads or those kinds of things. The refugee issue just seems like such a big problem to solve. But as you've shown us well, first of all, it's in line with the international will, international law, and it requires going at it methodically, piece by piece. How can this be done? So once again, maybe you want to say a final word before we sign off here.
Oh, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you. And it would be my honor to come to Canada and speak to you person to person and meet all of you in person. Yes, the refugee issue is complicated. That doesn't mean that it's unresolvable or that the right of refugee return is not feasible. International law, like I said, has specific principles and practices. These situations, civil transfer wouldn't be considered an international crime if the international community didn't consider that it was worth addressing with reparations. And so, while it is complicated and it will take innovative approaches to implement Palestinian refugee return, it doesn't mean that we can't do it, and it doesn't mean that the situation is created. It doesn't mean that the situation that will be created post-return will be worse than the situation prior to return. It's the exact opposite, that we have to create a situation post-return that is better than the situation that we have today.
Lubna Shomali, is it Shomali or Shomali? Have I been saying it properly?
I mean, it can go either way, but I usually say Shomali.
Okay, Shomali. Shukran, Lubna Shomali. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for participating today. Have a good evening and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.